Greetings and welcome to the Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We hope that you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us on the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We've been now in the last several weeks kind of going through our history as Methodist people, and we started off a couple weeks ago kind of getting at where John Wesley started in England and how he kind of got things started and rolling, and then last week we made that transition from England to the United States, and so now we're over into the U.S. and things are beginning to kind of change. We're beginning to grow and to kind of get our feet under us, get used to being a church now, and so that's going to bring a whole new set of our history that is going to start as we begin that process. But we remember where we ended up last week. We remember here that one of the ways that we can know what our purpose is as Christian people, John Wesley writes about many times in his sermons, and he says it is to know, to love, and to serve God. That is one of the purposes that we have, or one way of describing our purpose as Christian people. Now, we can be good at that, and sometimes we aren't quite so good at that, and we struggle with that, and that's a part of who we are. This morning we're going to talk about some of those struggles that we had in trying to fill that mission. As we get going, I want to kind of start us off with one image that can kind of help us understand what it is that we're doing. If we describe ourselves as being on the long road to eternity, that sometimes along that road we can come up with times where we come across one of those things. Now, we know about that a lot because that's what the square just looked like not too long ago up there. Or I lived in Kansas City for a number of years, and Kansas City was notorious for its bad roads. I would leave my apartment to go to work in the mornings, and I would hit a pothole, and then about 2 minutes before I got to work, I would come out of that pothole. This was the type of roads that we had over there. What this means for us in the church is that there are times when we come up on that long road to eternity, that long journey we're on, we get to the edge of that, and we see this great big pothole, and we say, oh no, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to get around this? We can't go any farther, and we get stuck. We get stuck right at that edge because we can't go on anymore. That's the point we get kind of at one point in our history. We kind of got stuck, and we're struggling with how do we go forward from here. So as the story goes, we come along, and there are a couple of problems that begin to come up as we get our feet under us, as we begin to expand as a church and grow, especially as we begin to move west, first into the Ohio Valley, and then to the Mississippi, and then west beyond the Mississippi. There are some issues that begin to come up. One of those is this kind of issue of leadership, and who are our leaders, and how do we get them in? Francis Asbury, who was our first bishop of the Methodist Church in America, he established that bishops are elected, and that was a good move on his part. But then the next part of that, though, is that there were a group of folks that began to say, well, shouldn't just be our bishops, but also our presiding elders, which are, today we call them our district superintendents. They should also be elected. And there were a lot of folks that said no. In fact, the stance of the church was said, no, that's not the way this works. The bishop makes the appointments. Well, it came out then that one group decided that was not something that they could go with, and so they split off in about 1830, and they formed the Methodist Protestant Church. They began to branch out. So here we see one branch of the church begin to develop, and this starts the alphabet soup of Methodism. Because now we have the Methodist Episcopal Church, or MEC, and the Methodist Protestant Church, or MPC, and it's going to get worse from here. And this begins to describe our struggle, because we have a hard time with, especially as Americans, we're good at this, we both love our leaders and we distrust our leaders. With Francis Asbury, we had a great deal of trust in him. He was our first leader of American Methodism, and then he was ordained bishop, and he was our first American bishop that we had, and the greatest, almost by sheer force of his will alone, and the many horses that he rode throughout his ministry. He moved the church west. and began to expand the church and what it was that we were doing. He was the one that really got us started, and we're great with our founders. With the folks that are first, we love our founders, and it's after that though, because we still had some very strong leaders come up after that. One of them was Bishop William McKendry, but we're a little bit more distrustful of them. Because we look at him and say, wait a minute, I know you back when you were just a little guy growing up. Or I know you back when you were still just a lay person in the church before you ever started doing that whole preaching thing, much less when you got yourself elected to be bishop. We begin to distrust them. And so that's where we see this division rise out of. Now that issue of leadership is one that's going to stay with us though. It's going to stay with us for a good long while. But time would go on. That was about 1830. A little bit more time would go on, and just like the rest of our nation during this time, we began to kind of separate between north and south. And over in the places that you would expect those separations to take place. The biggest issue is the one over slavery. But that is by no means the only issue that was causing that strife. If you study the Civil War, you know that slavery was the main issue, but there were a whole lot of other things that get wrapped up in the middle of that. And the same is true for us. We started out being very much anti-slavery, even to the point that Bishop Asbury, Francis Asbury, and another bishop went to see George Washington at his home in Mount Vernon after he'd been elected president to talk about the issue of slavery and that it's wrong. This is at our very earliest beginnings, and at the very earliest beginnings of our nation. We knew this was going to be a problem. But time would go on. We would see the massive segregation and the plantations and the slavery in the South. The North even would begin to segregate on its own. And we began to see that there were a number of other splits, or not split, let me start that sentence over. Too many N-words right in a row. I'm not sure how to get past that now. We would see a bunch of other branches of the church begin to make their way out of this, over this issue of how do blacks figure into the church? How are they integrated? What do we do with slavery? How does this work? And so we begin to see a bunch of branches of the African Methodist churches begin to develop. So we have come out of this the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AME Zion, you'll hear it referred to a lot of times. African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME churches, those two are still in existence. Free Methodist Church, Wesleyan Methodist churches, Colored Methodist Episcopal churches, and all of these have acronyms that get associated with them. That's why I say this is the alphabet soup of our Methodist history, because we have all of these new branches that have developed off of here. And so we begin to see all of these things. So now we have the Methodist Protestant Church that has branched off due to leadership issue, the African Methodist churches that have branched off due to slavery and due to the role that blacks will play inside of the church. So we've got these two divisions. Now we begin to see all of this come back together again in the main Methodist Episcopal Church. For us as Methodists, this came to a head in 1844 when we split from the Methodist Episcopal Church and we became the Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South. And now we've got this split that has taken place mostly over the issue of slavery, but also over the issue of leadership, and then a whole host of other things. We see this divide happen. And this was a genuine split. They drew up articles of separation in about 1843, and it became official in 1844, and now we are two separate churches. And we would struggle with this, and how this works and how this plays out. And we would go then through the Civil War. We would go through that period, and we would come out on the other side of the Civil War. The Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, would be kind of in disarray. Many of their churches had been burned to the ground, or they were destroyed, or they were in other people's hands, or their leadership was scattered. It took them a while to pull things back together. The Northern Church was in pretty good shape coming up, and they started an aggressive campaign to move south and to start churches and take over churches and to spread south, to the point even that in About 1866 or 1869, there were 6 Methodist Episcopal Church South bishops that met up in Palmyra and put together a list of grievances against the Northern Church and said, this is the problems we've got with you all, what you have been doing. We're angry, we're not happy about this. I mean, gave a detailed and relatively accurate list of the things that the Northern Church was doing that they didn't like. One of the problems, though, was that we were in Missouri. Now, Missouri was a hard place in the Civil War because we were a mess. That's about the best way that I can describe where we were. As I've learned more about the Civil War, I remember reading in one place saying there were as many battles that took place in Missouri as took place everywhere else. And by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, Missouri is still a mess. And when we're talking about Methodist churches, we're still kind of confused about what's going on because we've got lots of overlap between the two. The Oak Grove Church was a South church. I believe the Eolia Church was a South church. And then we get to Bowling Green, and we had a North Church. It was an old wooden building. And then we're in the old South Church.
No, you're backwards.
Are you backwards? We were the North Church? I thought we were, okay. I thought we were okay. There were both of us in town here at that time. I'm glad Bob was up here, didn't he? Because we were backwards. But were both of us here. And this was just part of where we were. And this was just in Missouri. As we went farther west, it became even more confused. The overlap, how were everyone working together? It took us a while to figure that out. Now next week we're going to talk about how we came back together and how we got to where we are today. We would eventually come back together, but at this point in time, this is where we are. We are split into all of these different branches. And the ones in red here will eventually come back together. You'll see the rest of this chart next week. But we'll eventually come back together. Most of those there are still in existence today, still going strong in lots of different places. But what would it mean for us if things would have been a little bit different? What does this mean for us today? Because we don't necessarily have the issue of slavery today that's dividing us, but we still have a whole bunch of other issues. We've still got a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 other issues that are kind of combining together to threaten us. We still have issues surrounding leadership that we're struggling with. We are still staring right here. We've come back today almost full circle. We're standing kind of at the edge of this at another time where we've got to decide what are we going to do now that we're here. How are we going to get beyond this? Are we just going to stand here and say there's no going on? We've got to split and just go our own separate ways because we can't overcome this place where we find ourselves. Jesus is pointing something out in our reading out of Matthew today. He says this: every kingdom involved in civil war becomes a wasteland. Every city or house torn apart by division will collapse. Now, Matthew is writing, Jesus is talking in response to the Pharisees. There's kind of one situation that's going on, but Jesus is speaking more to kind of what they are doing and what is taking place, and he's saying, if you are dividing yourself, this is what happens. You can't stand under that weight because whenever we split things up, whenever we separate them, there's not enough left for either side to really stand on its own. Things will fall before you have to build them back up, and that's where we're going to see the church go after the Civil War. Is things have split, and they've got to build themselves back up after that because you can't stand when you split in those ways. But what can we do? What is it that Jesus is trying to teach us in this? Well, one of the things is this. Here's that same pothole. It's really not that big a deal. It's big, it's important, you've got to take account of it, you've got to do something with it. But if we're talking about the long road to eternity, we can get around those. We can find a way around those things that threaten to eat us up, but sometimes we can't just focus on that on its own. That's where we get into trouble. We have this focus that comes, and all we see is that pothole. All we see is that thing that is going to block us around. We can get around this. Jesus continues on, and we get to the end of verse 30. Whoever isn't with me is against me, and whoever doesn't gather with me scatters. Oftentimes we hear this verse used in ways that would say, well, Jesus is saying, groups will use it to say, well, this is how we know we're going to be victorious and we are going to win over and against all of our enemies. Jesus doesn't normally talk about who's going to win what battle and who's not going to win what battle. That's not something Jesus does. What Jesus is describing is saying, remember who you go with when we come to those times when we don't think that we're going to be able to get past. Remember who brings us here. Remember who it is that helps us get past this. This is what Jesus is describing. That we come up to that time when we get to that point where we think there is nothing else that we can do when we are about to fall in or scatter or split or whatever. This is the time that we need to have the most faith. This is the time that we need to rely on Him most because He can bridge that gap. Imagine what our nation would have been like if as a church we hadn't split in 1844. And that's not just a flippant comment on my part either, because Methodists were heavily involved in every aspect of government, of life. You can find us everywhere. By the time we'll get to the year 1900, Methodists will make up 1920. We'll make up between 5 and 6% of the population in the United States. And every place you go west of the original 13 colonies, you're going to find a Methodist church. Or you'll find a Methodist class leader, or you'll find a preacher, or you'll find an itinerant pastor, or you'll find a Methodist somewhere that you go. What would have happened if we would have gone differently in 1844? Sometimes we have to, we get caught right on the edge, and we've got to say, how do we come back from that? How do we pull back from that? How do we be different so that we continue to do the work that God has set in front of us? As we go through the next coming weeks, we're going to hear lots, especially in the build-up to the next election, but any time really, we're going to hear lots of language that is used that is nasty, is separating, it's splitting, it's dividing, it's angry. It is doing everything it can meant to build a divide between people. As people of faith, what would happen if we can sit down and we can say, here's how we overcome that. This does not have to divide us. This does not have to split us. We can overcome the obstacles that are in front of us, no matter how big they are, because of the power of Jesus Christ. Let us go and take that power with us as we go into these next days and weeks and months and years to come. And remember who it is that can take us over these troubled times. And let us do that in Christ's name. Amen.